Many thanks for this introduction. Now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Guy Berger, who is the Director for Strategies and Policies in the field of communication and information at UNESCO. Guy, it's really nice to see you here today. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, and I hope you can hear me okay. So just a quick introduction of myself. I work at UNESCO, as you said. People, of course, know UNESCO very well from World Heritage, but the work I do at UNESCO is in a strong program to deal with information and communication, especially about the right to freedom of expression. And I think there's two dimensions of this rights that are super important for this whole study of infodemics. So the one is your right to impart information and opinion, of which, for example, your right to press freedom and to make public communication is an example. It's so important to be able to impart information and opinion because, for example, that's how we know about the story of disinformation. Journalists are investigating it. Journalists are also showing that it's still there in social media, despite efforts by some of the companies to deal with it. So the right to impart. Then the right to seek and receive, which points to freedom of information, your right to have access to data, for example, about infection rates and so on, and procurement. And it's about transparency. And the right to seek and receive information is also about issues like media and information literacy, which were discussed or touched on before, because people, if you access information or content and you don't have the literacy to understand issues around it, it doesn't really give you effective access. Now, the operative word in terms of imparting information and seeking and receiving information is information, because we're not speaking about imparting disinformation or seeking disinformation or access to disinformation. But of course, in the infodemic, you've got this whole bundle. And so we need to remember, and at UNESCO, we try and do this in the infodemic, how do we keep the focus on the right to information in as much as we are combating this other kind of content, which we wouldn't even want to call information, but it's content. And so the challenge in the infodemic is how do we increase imparting, seeking, and access to information on the one hand, so elevating, and how do we reduce the supply, the transmission, and the receipt of false and misleading content? And then how do we make sure the actions on this side don't become actions that weaken this side? And so that, by way of introduction, is where UNESCO comes from in the work in this infodemic sphere. Thank you.
Many thanks, Guy, for this word of introduction. And indeed, what matters is really finding the right balance so that we can protect freedom of expression and access to information. And I will now give the floor to Miguel Luengo-Oroz, who is the Chief Data Scientist at the United Nations Global Pulse. Miguel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sylvie. So, I mean, just as an introduction, so UN Global Pulse is the UN Secretary General's innovation initiative on data innovation and artificial intelligence. Okay, so we develop tools, policies, and frameworks to help build a future where, like, these digital technologies can be used safely and responsibly as for the public good. So, through our network of innovation labs, we work together with our UN colleagues, government, private sector, academia, and civil society to really test and deploy these new innovations, these operational tools. So since the beginning of the pandemic and the infodemic, we have been helping our colleagues from WHO, UNESCO, and others really on the operational response on the ground. So, I mean, I'd like to just take the advantage now and ask Guy if he can tell us a little bit about, I mean, which can be like the main challenges that we find inside the UN family.
Thanks, Miguel, and I will ask you a question after I respond to your one.
Okay.
So the first point I'd make is that congratulations to World Health Organization for convening this third conference, and indeed World Health Organization is on the front line of this infodemic as it impacts on health. But in the UN more broadly, the infodemic conceived more broadly also impacts other UN organizations. For example, UN Development Program, they do a lot of work supporting the credibility of elections. So obviously, the infodemic is a problem for the integrity of free and fair elections. Then you have a UN Environmental Program. They have to wrestle with false and misleading information about climate change. At UNESCO, we do a lot of work on press freedom, safety of journalists, and we have to deal with now disinformation being used to attack journalists. And we train a lot of journalists. So now we have to figure out how to train journalists not to be hoaxed by disinformation, and indeed how to dig in and tell the whole story. Now, if you also think of UN organizations that deal with migration, with refugees, disasters, so it goes, the whole UN family in its respective components that are related to the different SDGs, they are all confronted increasingly by this infodemics challenge. And despite all the different fields that the different UN family members are working in, there's a lot that's happening in the disinformation space that's relevant. So sometimes the actors who are involved are overlapping. They're not siloed. Often their techniques are echoing each other. They use the same internet companies as their channels, and they often cross-platform amplify. And in the end, of course, there's just one public that gets caught up and even implicated in this whole infodemic issue. So despite all the different interests in the UN and the different mandates, we do have a common interest and insight into how one sphere is working. So just as the rest of the UN can and is learning a lot about how the World Health Organization and how health infodemic managers are operating, so those of you who are in the health sector, you can benefit as World Health Organization shares with you the insights that come out of work elsewhere in this big ecosystem. So the challenge then is to really work as one UN and learn the general lessons about infodemics. But very quickly, we have another challenge. And this is, I think people could keep this in mind. The purveyors of disinformation, which then can convert into misinformation, these are often, as everybody knows, leading political figures who are from the member states that make up our UN organizations, and they define our mandates. And so we have to look at this multi-stakeholder set of responses, because civil society and media can call out presidents for doing disinformation, for example. But if you're in the UN or if you're a government employee, you have to find alternative ways to tackle this, because you can't very well go and point fingers at those who are your bosses, so to speak. But of course, we're concerned. We have a mandate and we have to fulfill it. We just have to do it in a way that really is leveraging the strengths of the UN organizations, taking into account also the parameters of these organizations. So I hope that sets out some of the challenges. So let me ask you now, Miguel, from a UN point of view, and particularly from Global Pulse's global role in the UN, how do you see the data and research challenge in terms of the knowledge that the UN as a whole needs to get to play its part in tackling the infodemic?
Yeah. So I think we need to do more to see the big picture. For me, sometimes I feel that we are fighting the infodemic a little bit blindly and in the trenches, and we really need to see the big picture. And for that, I think we need to be able to quantify, to monitor, and to evaluate, how our policies and how the infodemic is happening, okay? So we can build the foundations on data-driven policy. So I think that is what we're trying to do. But at this stage, we don't have enough science nor tools to understand the viral infodemic spread of the messages, across the platforms. And as we know, social media favors emotive content, regardless of the scientific or the health basis. And I think we are all experiencing a lack of algorithmic transparency from many of the stakeholders, from internet information, social media platforms. I think we need to understand those flows of information, to understand the big picture, and help coordinate, I mean, all other actors and provide the right information, making sure that arrives to everybody. But Guy, I mean, which are like the solutions that for information sharing that are being like shared within the UN?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you touched on an interesting point, Miguel, because you were speaking about how data can convert ultimately into knowledge. And in between those two, we have a kind of information. And so what we're trying to do in the UN, as you know, of course, is we're trying to share information, and then you are coming in to enrich with data, and hopefully we can convert both the data and the information into knowledge. So we've had two intra-agency dialogues within the UN in the past couple of months. We had a third one that reached out also to two other international organizations to see how they are dealing with this from that vantage point. And then, of course, there's the World Health Organization, Africa Infodemic Alliance, which involves several members of the UN. And UNDP have been exchanging information and doing a global consultation to try and get more insight and information about what's happening in terms of people's perceptions on infodemic. And so I think that there is some momentum. There was actually a joint statement at the UN General Assembly a bit earlier this year by, I think it was 8 or 9 UN organizations. So we have a lot of momentum, and I think this is good. And at the same time, this momentum of exchanging information has educated us all, certainly me personally, in these exchanges. I've realized that this infodemic, it's a bit like understanding the internet and internet companies like a supermarket, because you know, suppose you want to find out about people's diets. Well, you can go into the supermarket and you can see that there's a couple of security guards in the supermarket to see that nobody's tampering with the goods on the shelves. At the same time, we begin to recognize there are no independent health inspectors coming in to visit those premises. And then what I've also learned through these exchanges in the UN is that we have to go a bit deeper to see the deeper logic of the venue, like what kinds of products are on offer in the supermarket? Where do they come from? Do they have quality labels? What is being presented in prime locations to encourage us to buy? And what's the purpose of this? And so in a nutshell, I've learned, and I think others in the UN have learned, moderation is really important in this internet space, but curation, the basic curated environment and its business model is also super important, and we have to take into account both. I hope that's an example of the kind of insight we're getting in the UN through this information sharing. Now, let me ask you, Miguel, at the level of research and data sharing within UN organizations and between UN organizations and others, give us a snapshot, if you can, of where we are with that.
Yeah, I think that even before like the data and the research, I think something that is happening and something I'm just linking with what the UK government representative said before, we are starting to have like new profiles, new skills, new capabilities inside our UN agencies. And we're seeing this happening also in governments and other organizations, which are fluent in this new like data science space, in this data space, which, as you have said before, can go deeper in the discussions of what is algorithmic transparency, what makes sense. I mean, which are these automatic filters which are shaping the infodemic environment. So I think that's like, for me, one of the things that we are moving ahead inside the UN is really like building these capacities as one important building block. Then there are, initiatives all over the system. We have seen information volunteers from the Verified campaign. When other organizations like the EU is putting a lot of effort on collaboration with fact-checking organizations. And perhaps one thing which, one particular example from our side, which is a collaboration between many agencies, is working, for instance, not just on social media, but also as our following what our colleagues from civil society said, like working on radio, really using radio as a communication, which is for people, but also using tools to monitor radio stations. Out of the 7,000 languages which are in the world, just 100 are in the digital space. So that's clear that not everybody is accessing the right health information. And we have the tools with all this like machine learning and like digital technologies to make sure that we can leave no voice behind. So I guess that's one of our important contributions, and I think the UN collaboration around these communities which have more problems to get good access. So, I mean, what will be the asks that you will have for next year? What will be the actions and the things that you have seen that we as the UN family are taking for moving ahead?
Well, I think what you just said, Miguel, is that this UN knowledge and information sharing internally has an external feed out also to strengthen other actors out in that space. And I think that is a very important thing we will, as UN family, continue to do, and we must do it in the coming year. I think, though, what we also have to do is to strengthen the norm that truth matters. Not that truth is simple, but that truth matters, because we still face real challenges to this. And without having truth, we don't have a standard to promote peace and progress. So I think as UN, its global role in terms of saying what is acceptable conduct of all actors, norms become so important, and that we have to do a lot of mobilization of our different constituencies to help play their part along with us. And I think our informal dialogue can actually, within the UN, can help us strengthen this. And we may reach a point also that we can have, as UN in the coming year, a really serious dialogue with the internet companies, because they are the core vectors of the infodemic. And so what we want to do is make sure they're not just enabling, but in some cases fueling the infodemic, but they do become more geared towards deep solutions, and with some urgency, and in fields besides the health crisis. Now, I think we've probably overlapped our time a bit, Miguel, but just quickly, do you, from your point of view of UN data, what do you think in 2021 are the top imperatives that the UN should be asking of itself and of others concerning the infodemic from a data lens?
So, I mean, just to go very quickly, I think we have to look for common principles and approaches when engaging with platforms on the issues on like accountability and transparency. I think one key challenge here is defining metrics and common reference data sets, which allow us to evaluate like the scaled infodemics and the performance of our tools. As we were saying, I mean, we really need to be able to measure to see the big picture at the scale. Another key issue that I think is going to attract more and more attention is going to be like really making sure that the underlying infrastructure, which is made of artificial intelligence, of those digital platforms, is trustworthy, is ethical, and respect human rights. Okay? And I think that is one of really of our key challenges. Just a couple of more notes. One is I think we all, I mean, not just the UN, but all the stakeholders in this conference, we really need to anticipate what is going to be the future of disinformation and misinformation. Tomorrow is going to be something different. I mean, and it's going to be a different social network. It's going to be a different way of communicating. So really, we need to have a future foresight. We really need to see what is coming before it's coming, okay? So we can like surf the tsunami. And that has to be done with the help also of science. And we need all science, all hands on deck, including like data science, AI experts, machine learning experts, social scientists, and public health experts. So I think this is really a truly multidisciplinary challenge. But I mean, I would be speaking for a few minutes more, but I think we already passed our time. But you have any last comment, Guy, or we hand back to Sylvie?
I think we should hand back, but again, I just repeat that the World Health Organization and its constituency of experts and infodemic managers, we are watching you with great interest, and we are learning a lot from you, and we hope we can continue to feed our insights back into the work you do. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Guy and Miguel. And really, it was nice to see that first As UN, we are a family. And this is very important. And indeed, we have done a lot of efforts to work together in spite of the very busy agenda we all have. And thanks, Guy, for highlighting the challenges that we are facing as UN organization due to the very nature of our governance. And thanks, Miguel, for highlighting also the way forward with quantifying, monitoring, evaluating infodemic and interventions, and anticipating what would be the challenges of the future. And as you say, rightly, we are here to also support all our member states and the countries, and more than 130 countries already adopted or pushed for a resolution at the UN Assembly to have a collective action to manage infodemic better. And we will support all those countries and all those communities as a UN family based on our UN principles, and including, of course, the protection of human rights. So thanks a lot to both of you for this perspective. And I would like just to say that Guy mentioned that UNESCO sometimes people don't know the full scope of UNESCO activities. I think I can say the same for WHO, and just highlight that the music you have been hearing was from some of the trainees of the Infodemic manager training, and in particular from Indira, who is in Cameroon. So I think this shows that WHO also value very much arts and not only pure science. Thank you.